Hey everyone, this is Charlie Shrem, and you're listening to Untold Stories. This is a show where we dive deep into the lives and personal histories of some of crypto's most influential leaders and find out how the crypto movement truly came to be. Let's dive in. This podcast is presented by Blockworks Group, the only blockchain event and media production company I trust. For exclusive content and events that provide insight into the crypto and blockchain space, visit them at blockworksgroup.io. I promise you won't be disappointed. Today's a beautiful day here. I just had an awesome egg frittata, and I'm really excited to get my first guest here today, Wiz. Wiz, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, bro.
You know, it's very interesting because you have been at ground zero for the crypto space, especially in the past few years, being in Japan, being at the forefront of some of the Mt. Gox stuff that's been going on. And I want to talk about some of that stuff. Let's do that a little bit later. But I really want to talk about who you are. And a lot of the podcasts and a lot of the talks that I give, the question is always, how did you get into Bitcoin? Why did, where were you? What were you wearing? That was a very odd question. Someone once asked me, what was I wearing when I got into Bitcoin? Like, why would I remember that? But I want to jump on a cliche for a second and tell me a little bit about you. And, you've probably heard of, this is a very long form question, of course, but you've probably heard of a lot of different technologies. We'll get into this. You ran your own internet service provider. You worked for private internet access, which is the VPN that I use. And it seems like you've been in the cypherpunk movement for a long time. But why Bitcoin?
I guess I started very, very young. I started my career when I was 14 years old. I dropped out of school to work as a network engineer for this local internet provider in downtown Honolulu, where I grew up, which was just a startup at the time. I was like a intern configuring Cisco routers for DSL customers. I was working in the data center installing servers, and I was like a teenage hacker. Got into a little bit of trouble here and there.
So was I. Well, gray hat and white hat mostly, but I hung out on a lot of the, Cyber Extreme, the Unknown, Evil Zone, IRC, stuff like that.
Yeah, I pretty much grew up on IRC. FNet. I actually ran an FNet IRC server from Hawaii, which was pretty crazy.
Were you that guy who attacked my Freenode server?
Yeah, funny thing. You know who owns Freenode now?
Who?
Private Internet Access bought it, I think, last year.
Oh, I didn't know that. And
yeah,
is it so private? There's a lot of crossover that people don't realize between the crypto world and the cypherpunk, crypto anarchist, or the anarcho-capitalist world. So, Freenode, can you explain to everyone what Freenode is exactly?
I guess Freenode is a privately owned IRC network, which is a little bit different from the IRC networks that I grew up on, like FNet, which is much more decentralized. But
Freenode was the largest.
Maybe it is now. I know back in the day, FNet was certainly the largest. I mean, that was probably the original IRC network. It was more decentralized, where there was not so much governance structure. I mean, Freenode is just privately owned by one person, right?
Now it is, but when it first launched, wasn't it like a consortium of ownership of different groups?
I'm pretty sure Freenode was always centralized, in the sense that all the servers were run by the same person. I remember you couldn't link a server to Freenode. You had to like sponsor one or host one or something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, FNet was really cool because you could just kind of run your own IRC server and then request to link it to the network. And if you were friends with everyone, they would let you in. And that's how I got my irc.aloha.net linked when I was like 18 years old or something like
that. FNet was the first one. And Freenode was launched originally on FNet, but eventually like you said, all the Freenode servers, there was like 20 or 30 of them around the world, was owned, I guess, by one group or one person. But they actually kind of touted themselves as super open source and everyone's welcoming. And they were pretty hands off on what you can say or do on the chat network, except for if you started doing like actually attacking the server itself.
Sure, nobody likes to get DDoSed, but they had services, whereas FNet was the Wild West. You know, people would take over your channel and they would do all kinds of crazy things on FNet. So all the centralized IRC networks like Dalnet or Freenode or even NewNet, they all had services, whereas FNet, I think to this day, and will probably never have services, was totally different experience, right? You could just DDoS someone, and take over their channel and kick them out, and
that would happen to me all the time. It was really sad. But a lot of the so all the main Bitcoin channels, and even the ones that Satoshi used to hang out on, all the ones from 2011 were all on Freenode. Interestingly enough, though, Freenode, like you said, is owned by private internet access Andrew Lee, and Andrew Lee was one of the North American directors of Mt. Gox.
Yeah, what a coincidence.
What a crazy coincidence. There's so much connection under that. And I remember I met Andrew in 2011. Great guy. I still chat with him every 6 months or so. We should get him on the show, actually. And he, I met him. It was me, him, and Moot, the creator of 4chan, sitting in a room in New York City. Interestingly enough, at the a law school, and New York Law was doing a conference on, interestingly enough, decentralization. I don't know why back in 2011, but he was there. Moot from 4chan was there. The founder of 4chan was there, and then you had the Fiverr guys who, all the guys who had founded Pirate Bay, they were there. So all the Pirate Bay guys were there. This was right after their major arrest and all the crazy stuff that was going on in Sweden and everything. So a few of them were there, and Andrew Lee was there, and we all kind of got, and then it was Bruce Wagner, but I don't want to talk about Bruce Wagner. Remember Bruce Wagner?
I never met him, but
Okay,
I've heard some people say that he might be Satoshi.
No, he's not. He was definitely not Satoshi, but he definitely took a lot of our Bitcoins, a lot of people's Bitcoins. But whatever, I don't want to get into that right now. We'll digress for hours. But essentially, we were all sitting in a room together, and I remember talking to the Fiverr guys, and Fiverr is great. I still use it now. Like, what do you guys think of Bitcoin? And they're like, listen, we just got arrested in Sweden for running the Pirate Bay. I think we just want to just chill out for a little bit. I think one world-changing killer technology that we're all going to get arrested for is enough for today. Ask me a year from now.
Yeah, the Pirate Bay guys were certainly crazy. I mean, they would post their legal takedown notices on the front page of their website and just kind of spit in the face of Hollywood and even the whole U.S. legal system, right? So you can understand. It's kind of like an Assange situation or something, where Sweden was giving them asylum, so to speak, with their torrent tracker. And, they did all kinds of cool stuff. Like they pretended the server was in North Korea, and they would spoof all these BGP announcements so you couldn't tell where the server really was. And, where the actual servers were.
Yeah,
was
no one
totally
knew.
Different location from where the proxy was, where you would access it from, right? So the police would go to a data center to seize the servers, but it was just like a proxy relay going somewhere else. So they would be back up in hours, right? They would just turn on the backup proxy site.
There was a great documentary that everyone should watch about the Pirate Bay. But I wanted to you brought up a good point. I saw a chart yesterday that showed that people searching for Netflix overlaid on a chart of people searching for torrents, and anyone who's over the age of 25 will remember, even younger than that, remember searching for torrents and listening and watching, and just torrenting was the way of sharing files over the internet for at least when you and I grew up. And so, but the chart was overlaid between searches for Netflix and searches for torrenting. And I think at this point, Netflix has eclipsed torrents, and the searching for torrents has gone way down.
Oh
And
yeah, for
I
sure.
wanted
Because it's all about convenience, right? It's all about I want to, sit naked on my sofa and push one button and watch Game of Thrones
even if you
versus
have to pay $9.
right. I'll pay the $9. It was never about the money, right? It was all about the UX and the convenience and the ease of use.
So at what point do we give up user experience for privacy? Because if you look at it like a lever system, right? Like think like Simpsons, Homer Simpson's in his nuclear reactor and he's got all these levers, and as one lever goes up, the other lever goes down. At what point we're pulling down privacy and decentralization and security, but the lever for user experience goes up? At what point do we give that up? Because if you ask a lot of people, that's the biggest issue with cryptocurrency today.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you just look at the cryptocurrency space, when you set up a Bitcoin full node and when you set up like a Monero full node, the amount of CPU resources and the amount of it's just insane to run a Monero full node is a ridiculously huge amount of computing resources compared to a Bitcoin full node, which you can just run on a Raspberry Pi, right? I think the end result is going to be something like Bitcoin, but with all these
Like
coin
Bitcoin
joins
Lite.
and well, no, I mean some kind of like Mixer or Wasabi wallet, where it's perfectly mixing all the transactions so that you can't tell. But despite all that, everything's kind of just in plain text and out there. There's a bunch of like Zcash and Monero zero knowledge proofs that make things very, very complicated. But I think in the end, blockchain analysis will just be defeated by simple, coin join mixer type transactions.
So I'm like a ride or die with Bitcoin. Bitcoin was it's my legacy as I see it. I love Bitcoin, and if Bitcoin is not it, then we've kind of lost and nothing else will be it. And on that note, the question I want to ask you is, I believe that the world and the industry, the large big four, Google, Facebook, they've woken up to the fact that the younger generation wants better financial services. And that's why we see Venmo. That's why we see Pop Money and all these different apps to make moving money easier. But at the same time, um, have will my question is, will Bitcoin be able to have its user experience gain fast enough where we'll be able to reach this mass use of cryptocurrency, or will it stay like a fringe thing where it's more of like fun, like a novelty, or we'll be able to eclipse something like Venmo?
Well, I think Bitcoin is many things, right? It's a store of value, most importantly. But now that we have the Lightning Network, it's a very convenient, fast, secure medium of exchange as well. I don't know if
I
you, I
agree
don't
with
know
you.
if you, yeah, if you
I
use
completely
Lightning at
agree with you.
all.
It's I use Lightning and it's amazing, and and you're right, 100%. But the question, I guess, my question is more the user experience, because at the end of the day, we care about privacy and decentralization. But let's be realistic. We all use Facebook. We all use Twitter. We all use a lot of these apps where we basically hand over our privacy, and there are ways to basically control your privacy better. But most people don't care. But the people that don't care are the ones that we need. Bitcoin is not fully decentralized yet. It's on the what I call the path to decentralization. It's getting there. It's the only one that really is on that path. But Bitcoin is not decentralized enough yet for it to be a 2 to 5 thousand year store of value. It's getting there. We need more nodes. We need more minor decentralization. We need more people using it. So the people to use it are the ones that right now don't really care for it. So how do we get them to care, I guess, is my question. But more of my question is, how have we run out of time? Are people okay with Venmo and just will not care ever? And these are some hard
Yeah.
questions, and I don't want them. I don't want to be right here. I don't want to be wrong. I just want to. I want to make me feel better, actually, because I love Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think you're asking many questions at the same time. Like, of course, Venmo and PayPal and all those centralized payment processing services are very convenient and easy to use. And I don't think the real killer use case of Bitcoin is to compete with Venmo. It's to compete with USD and JPY and fiat currencies, right? And I think regardless of whether a government sanctioned central bank is printing out fiat currency on paper or digital dollars in a central database, or altcoins and shitcoins and ICOs just printing out tokens, I think the real killer use case for Bitcoin is the fact that the supply is capped at 21 million Bitcoin. It can't be censored or controlled. And that's really what's
It's a
going to make it win.
censorship resistant chain.
Digital scarcity,
Yeah,
right?
it's censorship resistant, digital scarcity, and to me, that's the number one reason. And like you said, there are a lot of other uses for Bitcoin or blockchain, which is like the term of today.
Yeah, you're going to have the store of value first, right? Which Bitcoin, I think, is rapidly becoming an alternative to gold or any other hard asset. And next, it's going to be taking on the Venmo and the PayPal, and that's what Lightning is, right? So now Lightning's kind of coming online. I did a meetup in Tokyo a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, where we were selling beers in the bar, beers and pizza for Lightning. And man,
What kind of pizza?
barbecue chicken pizza,
Oh man, that
pepperoni
sounds so good right now. I'm on a
pizza.
keto diet, so I can't eat that.
Yeah, but I'm sure you're having some good steaks,
I
so
every
nothing,
night, every night.
nothing to complain about. Yeah, I just think once you use Lightning and you realize that the Lightning Network solves both the scalability problem and the instant confirmation problem. You know, if you just send a normal Bitcoin transaction, you have to wait like 10 or 20 minutes to get a confirmation if you don't trust the person. Now you get Lightning, you just instantly know that you have the money and you can give them the pizza or the beer without any risk of a double spend attack. That's actually really huge.
So what was that meetup like? What type of people were there?
Well, it was pretty cool. We had Nicolas Dorier presenting about BTC Pei Server. We had Christian Moss presenting about his Lightning wallet called Pebble, and it was pretty cool to see, you know, the Pebble wallet being used for the BTC Pay Server node, which is running for the bar, to buy actual pizza and beer at the bar live with Lightning. So it was like the ultimate dog fooding, you know,
So
Lightning
the
oriented.
experience has gotten better with Lightning, you would say.
Yeah, I mean it's really like the perfect form of money.
What was it like? What was it like growing up in Hawaii?
Hawaii is very isolated. I think it's the most isolated place in the whole world. So, you know, when you grow up in Honolulu, even, which is a real city, or even if you grow up one of the outer islands, which is just deep countryside, you hear about this world out there. You know, you hear about all these countries and Europe and Asia, and you know, it's some place that exists, but you don't really think about it. You're just so isolated in Hawaii. So when I was 20 years old, I came to Tokyo for, I think, a 1 week round trip ticket. And after 1 week, I decided I was staying, you know, and that was 13 years ago. I lived in Japan
Why Tokyo?
for well, Tokyo is amazing. You know, it's the biggest city in the world, and it's just, you know, it's endless crazy adventures. It's whatever you want to make it, right? You can make a business, you can make friends, you can find love, you can do anything in Tokyo, and it's very peaceful, it's very clean, it's very well organized. You know, there's lots of interesting characters like Mark Karpeles or Roger Ver, you know, that you might run into at the local Bitcoin meetup. You know, it's just so many people, so many things going on. It's really the center of the universe for a lot of things. Even in the Bitcoin scene in Tokyo is pretty cool.
Had you traveled to the mainland a lot as growing up?
Yeah, when I was 17 years old, I had a rack full of servers in a data center in Los Angeles, and I was doing this web hosting company. I don't know, I just never really felt an attachment to the US mainland, or I guess USA, America at all.
I want
I
to
mean,
I want
Hawaii,
to go into that a little bit. So here you are in Hawaii, and you kind of like east or west. Your life is
right.
at a pivotal point, and you either go United States mainland or you go Japan and Asia, and you jump to Asia, and I'm trying to understand why.
Yeah, that's a good point. Most people from Hawaii, you know, with a clue, who are pretty smart, they'll usually go to like Los Angeles or San Francisco or Las Vegas, somewhere on the mainland that has a good university or some career opportunities. I never really, I was the only white kid in my class in school growing up. It's just there's so much Asian culture in Hawaii, and I always felt more
What
drawn
year
to
was this?
Asia. What year
Or
was
the
this?
range?
Well, I guess I quit school when I was
90s?
14, so that would have been 99.
Okay.
Yeah. And I had pretty much done everything there was to do in Hawaii by the time I was 20 years old. I mean, that sounds kind of ridiculous to say, but I had my own little consulting business. I would go to some surf shop on the North Shore and fix their point of sale system. I would, work for all the telecom companies in downtown Honolulu. I mean, there's not a whole lot to do if you want a really serious professional IT career.
It's safe to say you were the Hawaii tech guy.
Yeah, there's not a lot going on in Hawaii for a teenage hacker kid who wants to start his own business or be a consultant. I mean, anyone with a clue basically goes to the mainland or goes to Asia and they work for Microsoft or now Google nowadays. So when I went to Tokyo when I was 20 years old, it was a no-brainer. I had a 1 week round trip ticket. After 1 week, I checked out of the hotel, got myself an apartment, started my own company, did consulting for a while.
What do you mean you started your own company? Did you have connections in Japan, or did you just kind of stay and say, I'll figure it out, work in a coffee shop or something?
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I was 20 years old, coming from my teenage years, I was crazy. I was so overconfident. It was kind of like being the biggest fish in this little pond in Honolulu, going out into the big ocean, the big wide world. And
You had a small fish in a really big ass pond.
yeah, exactly. I just way too overconfident, right? So after I moved to Tokyo,
Did you make any mistakes?
are you kidding me? Of course. So as soon as I moved to Tokyo, I realized I don't speak any Japanese. I don't know anybody in Japan. So even if I,
It would help.
yeah, even if I wanted to, I couldn't even get a job at the Family Mart or the 7-Eleven, right? I realized that there's no way I'm going to be a successful consultant right now. So I got myself a job at Opera Software in their, which is a Norwegian software company, or it used to be anyway, in their Tokyo branch office. And that was a really great job because I got to work with all these very, very skilled engineers taking care of their Japanese customers, which were all huge Japanese companies like, Toshiba, Panasonic, Fujitsu, Sony, even Nintendo. Like the Nintendo Wii used to be powered by Opera and all these cool projects.
Really?
Yeah. Pretty much every Japanese TV has some code that I hacked on there running inside it.
Did you end up learning Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't learn Japanese from working at Opera, but I just kind of picked it up over the years. Yeah, I've been in Japan for like 13 years. I would say the most difficult.
How do you just pick up Japanese?
Well, the first 2 or 3 years is really tough because if you haven't studied at all, you're just struggling to say basic things like numbers or days of the week or, just elementary school level. But once you kind of get past that, you reach this critical mass point of you don't know what something is, but you know enough Japanese where you can kind of explain it in some different words, and then you can learn new words very rapidly, and then you learn very quickly from there. So now
the vocabulary stage.
Yeah, I guess so, right? The vocabulary stage is a good way to put it.
Once you get to that stage when learning any language, when you're just now learning words, but you have grammar down pat and you know enough words to explain yourself, or you know enough words to explain that you don't know what that word is, but you can say enough things to make someone understand.
Exactly.
You've reached a pretty good level. I would say almost fluent in Japanese, but you're just learning new words.
Exactly, yeah. So once you get to that point, you can go anywhere, you can meet anyone and just kind of start talking like you would in your native language. And I think I already had enough Japanese culture, or at least a basic understanding just from growing up in Hawaii, because most people in Hawaii are third generation or fifth generation Japanese or Chinese or Korean or Filipino or from Europe somewhere. There's such a big mix in Hawaii where you have at least a basic understanding of a few other cultures. So that really helped.
So here you are in Japan working for Opera or someone, and you learned about Bitcoin, and would you say that you fell in love with Bitcoin because it jived with your tech background and freedom background, or was it more because you here you are you're in Japan, and like you said, you're a small fish in a big pond, and you're not really different. You are different, but you don't really stand out. And here you are now in the crypto space, or the Bitcoin space as we called it, and you can stand out from everyone else. You could be different.
Yeah, that was a very interesting time. So you're right. I was at Opera Software when I first heard about Bitcoin. And I think the way I first heard about it was actually from the Honolulu connections I had at the time. I think Bitcoin was about $8 when I first got into it. And it was only trading on probably Mt. Gox and maybe BTCE or whatever the exchanges at the time were. And I remember I
Do you
bought.
remember BTC?
Yeah, I remember. We'll talk about BTC later, but yeah, $8. I bought one Bitcoin at $8, and I think I bought it from someone at the hackerspace in Honolulu or something like that. And I remember when Bitcoin went up to like $100 on Mt. Gox. Then I was like, okay, I'm going to start trading this. I'm going to start figuring out what is this Bitcoin thing. And at first it was just something that your friends kind of told you about, or maybe you read about it on Slashdot. And I remember my friend posting like, "Oh yeah, I bought Bitcoin at $8, and now I'm selling it at $100, and I can buy this hard drive." And he was really happy about that. Kind of geeky things. But back in those days, it was so new. It was really pure.
But like you said, you weren't thinking Lambos, you were thinking new hard drives.
Right. That's a good way to put it. You didn't, unless you were already a multimillionaire, you wouldn't throw more than a couple $100 into Bitcoin at that time. It was very experimental, very new. And
that's why, save for a few people, most original OGs didn't have the money to put the money in to be able to become massively wealthy. And two, we were already so involved in the space, we had to work other day jobs to feed our families.
That's true. Most OGs, I think, if you weren't already financially successful, Bitcoin didn't really make you rich or wealthy at all. Maybe you made thousands of dollars from Bitcoin over the years, but you didn't make millions of dollars, right?
During the first Bitcoin bubble, I was touted as the first Bitcoin millionaire. This was 2013, like 6 months before I was eventually arrested. But truth be told, and Bloomberg Businessweek put down a full color page ad about me and everything. Here's the Bitcoin millionaire. But I had explained to them in private that, yes, I'm a millionaire, but I'm a millionaire because I own a large piece of a company that raised money at a $10 million valuation. So technically, I'm, yes, a millionaire, but that doesn't make a good story. So they put this whole thing, oh, here's the Bitcoin millionaire. But at the time of printing, at the time that was printed, I think I had like maybe $40,000 in my bank account.
Yeah, I think we were all around the same level at that time. I remember trading arbitrage on Gox and Bitstamp. When Bitstamp opened up, there was this huge arbitrage opportunity. I don't know if you remember the Gox Premium, but when Mark was running, when Mark was delaying the withdrawals for various reasons, there was first he suspended the fiat withdrawals. Remember, so you couldn't.
The fiat withdrawals went first, right. So people had to buy Bitcoin to get their money out, and they were willing to buy Bitcoin at a 25-30% premium just to get the Bitcoin off.
Yes, exactly. And so the thing about that was that if you had a local bank account in Japan, you could do a domestic Japanese bank withdrawal, and it would actually go through very quickly, like in maybe 2 or 3 days, you could get your money out of Gox in fiat. So
in JPY though, in Japanese yen.
Yes, but he had some kind of bot where you could sell BTC for JPY at I think 3% more than spot or something reasonable. So you're making, like you said, 20-30% on the arbitrage, and you're probably losing.
This was what year?
I want to say 2013. Yeah.
It was 2013.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, about once a week I could do one cycle. I would buy Bitcoin on Bitstamp, send the Bitcoin to Mt. Gox, sell it at a 30% premium from what I bought it at an hour earlier, and then withdraw the money to my Japanese bank account and then wire that money to Bitstamp, right? Which, yeah, about once per week. Of course, in the end, we got Goxed. It's a whole nother conversation, I suppose.
A lot of people listening to this are either not familiar with the story, are vaguely familiar with the story, or more people probably lost money on Mt. Gox.
Yeah. I think if you're an OG and you haven't lost money from some exchange or from some scam, you know what I mean? That means you weren't really active in the Bitcoin.
There were so many.
There were so many, right? Like how many times?
Crypto exchange, the one in Australia, 30 grand.
Yeah, I mean, how many times did we get screwed over by? It's Bitcoin, it's crypto. There's a lot of scams out there. So even if you're a newcomer, you're probably getting scammed, right? It's just that OGs have been scammed so many times now.
We're jaded.
Yeah, we're jaded, right? It's like, yeah, of course you're gonna probably lose a little bit here or there.
Someone sent me, a friend of mine who runs a conference company, sent me a message the other day. He runs these conferences all over the world, and they're not crypto conferences, but he does like crypto sub conferences within the conferences. And he sent me a message and he said, "Hey, have you heard of this coin?" And I was like, "No." I didn't even look it up. I didn't even check CoinMarket. I didn't check it. I just said, "No, I never heard of it." I was busy. I was doing something. And he said, "Well, our normal sponsorship is 20 grand, but they're willing to pay us 50 grand for the normal sponsorship, but it's in their coin." I was like, "Scam." I didn't even look. I didn't look it up. I just said scam. Exactly. And then he's like, "Well, you don't even know what it is." I was like, "Okay." So I go to CoinMarketCap and they're listed there. And yeah, 40% pump, but there's $7 of volume. Yeah, and I said, "Dude, you cannot take even $100 of this coin. You will lose. Do not take it."
And that pretty much sums it up, right? Every scam, well, not every scam, but most altcoin scams are the same concept. It's either pump and dump or you're printing money, right? It's the same scam that the central banks do and the governments around the world. This is why Zimbabwe dollars are worthless, or why you need a million Vietnamese dong or Japanese yen. It's just the currencies have been so inflated. And it doesn't matter, like I said, with paper money or with tokens on a blockchain, the actual database used doesn't matter. It's the same scam. If you print tokens, you print money arbitrarily on worthless pieces of paper, worthless tokens, you're just stealing.
Sure. But don't you... So I will agree with you on that. And I will say that a lot of these have the intent to scam. A lot of them are just kind of oblivious and don't realize. But wouldn't you agree that even if like 1 out of 100 are not scams, you still need them to further the development of this whole space? Because let's be honest, like this whole industry is like throwing shit at the walls to see what sticks. And if we're not throwing shit at the walls, then we don't know what's going to stick.
Well,
but you can do that without arbitrarily taking other people's money and gambling with it, essentially.
Yeah, I think your 1% analogy is probably accurate. And I think a lot of scammers don't actually realize that they're scammers, right? Nobody...
That's the problem.
That's the problem, right? Even if you don't intend to defraud anyone, I've met so many people that don't even know anything about blockchains or ICOs, but they come and tell me like, "Oh, I just got hired as this advisor for this project." I'm like, "Let me guess, it's an ICO scam." They're like, No, it's not a scam. All the other advisors are really good people that, they're like very famous, reputable people that they trust and known for years. I'm like, the people that are doing the
closest to you,
yeah, they don't even realize that they're scamming people. But like I said, they're just printing tokens. And of course, they have some very complicated business model that distracts you from the fact that they're issuing their own money. We're going to revolutionize fill in the blank, by putting it on the blockchain, and you get points for doing this thing, and you get coins for, it's all a
So
distraction.
I want to get into Mt. Gox, but before I do that, I want to tell you a story that you just reminded me of. So because of my history in crypto, and my history of getting arrested and serving some time in prison here in the U.S., I'm always flagged as a potential like dangerous flyer. So whenever my wife and I come back from a trip overseas and come back into the States, which we probably do every few months. It's at a point where, if you ever fly to the US, you know that as soon as you get to customs, they stamp your passport, or any country, they stamp your passport and you move on your merry way. For me, they look at my passport, they type in some information and they say, Mr. Shrem, please follow this officer to a secondary inspection. And the first few times that happens, it freaked me out, but now I'm used to it. And in fact, I even have a printed piece of paper that I kind of tuck in my passport, and I put it, I give it to the customs officer when I get in, which has a little bit more details, because eventually when he asked me to go to secondary, it saves a little bit of time when the secondary officer has this piece of paper. I'm prepared already for this. It sucks, but at this point, there's nothing I could really do about it. So I go to secondary inspection, and I'm sitting there, and now because I'm married, they allow my wife to come with me. But it used to be when we were just engaged, she couldn't come with me, and she'd be freaking out in baggage claim because it would take an hour. So I would bring a book with me because you're not allowed to use your cell phones. Like I said, I'm prepared. So I'm in there, and customs officer calls my name. Very nice, very respectful. He asked me my name, asked me where I was, what I was doing there, asked me what industry I work in, and there's no beating around the bush. So I say I work in the cryptocurrency space. And they say, what do you do in the current cryptocurrency space? And I said, oh, I did this. And then they get into questions like, why were you in jail? And one guy even asked me, like, why did you commit your crime? And I said, what kind of question is that? Like, are you a judge or whatever? But one time the guy, he says, oh, you're in the cryptocurrency space. Really nice guy. And I said, yeah. He goes, he whips out his cell phone. He goes, my brother-in-law got me to buy, some of these coins called Vice coins or Vice tokens or something like that. And I was like, oh, and my wife is like sweating because this is her first time in secondary inspection. She's like sweating, what is going on here? Why is this guy asking about this token? Is it like a trap? Did you own this token, Charlie? Like, what's going on here? Like, why is this guy asking about a crypto token? So he's asking me about it, and I'm like, I've never heard of it. However, and I was being told I never heard of it before. I said, I never heard of it. However, if you want to give me your email address, I'm happy to like do some research and send you what I find. And I don't want to outright tell him that this is a scam, because like he showed me his cell phone and it literally had all the markings of this is a scam. So
you're just trying to get out of secondary. Like, you're just trying to.
I was just trying to get the hell out of that airport. I want to go home.
You should put all your money in this coin. It looks solid, 100%.
Like, looks great, man.
Karen's
great.
Bond Barons, man.
Can you stamp my passport now? So he lets me out finally. And no, so I said, if you want to give me your email address, then I can send you some research about this. He's like, well, I can't do that. And he immediately goes back to like customs officer mode. Like, I crossed the line, folds up, take his phone, folds it up, takes out my piece of paper. He goes, all right, Mr. Shrem, you're free to go. Stamps it, and you're go. I'm like, that literally was the weirdest experience I ever had dealing with like a customs officer.
Dude, the only time I ever got pulled in a secondary was in Canada, actually. And I had just gone to DEF CON in Vegas. So I had flown from Vegas to like Vancouver or somewhere. And it was a red-eye flight, probably 5 or 6 in the morning. And I land and I'm all totally out of it. And the immigration officer is asking me all these questions. And I think I answered some of the questions wrong. And it's like, all right, you're going to secondary. And instantly I'm in the room with all the Muslim people and the drug dealers. Like the guy next to me is like this Chinese kid who has a very long pinky fingernail. And there's like 5.
What?
Yeah, it's a thing, right?
No, what is that? What is that thing?
Apparently, in like Chinese culture, if you have a long pinky fingernail, I think it goes back to hundreds of years. That means you don't work in the fields if you have long fingernail, right? So it's like a status symbol or something. Anyway, I'm in
I
the
never heard
room.
that before. That's interesting.
Yeah, so the guy next to me has like 5 customers. I was just drilling them. It's like 6 in the morning, and I just came from DEF CON. I'm like all hungover, and he's like, "All right, so why are you coming to Canada? What are you doing here?" He's treating me like criminal. I'm like, "Well, I'm a security consultant, and I just went to this hacker conference in Vegas." He's like, "What? You're a
You
hacker?"
said the word hacker.
Yeah, yeah.
Why would you do that?
Well, I guess to normal people, I guess it's a very negative term, but in the security industry, white hat hacker is a legitimate profession. So he starts going through all my stuff, and I have all these like hacking tools that I picked up at DEF CON, like the badges from DEF CON that light up and everything, and all this, colorful hacker shit. So he's looking through all this stuff. He's like, "Oh, I guess you really are a hacker, security consultant." But it takes like an hour out of your life or longer, right? Just to go through that whole ordeal. And, he has to watch me go to the toilet because he thought I might be like throwing away drugs or something. It's just like secondary is like one of the worst experiences in the world. You have no rights. You're in this weird state where you're not even in the country. So like you have no rights as an individual or no constitutional guarantees. They can search everything, ask you all these questions. And if you're not a citizen of the country, they can just say, "We're denying you entry," and deport you basically.
Wow, interesting. So you've definitely been through similar situations, except you didn't
Yeah.
get asked to be about Vicecoin or Vice Token or whatever it was. I
Yeah,
don't
this
even
is
remember
kind
if
of
that was the name
before
of it.
crypto was mainstream. Or one time I was in secondary in Japan, and they, I had overstayed my visa by like one day or something.
Oh
And
no.
yeah, but I had a visa approved. It was just like a paperwork thing. Um, anyway, yeah, I mean, secondary sucks. I
Okay,
guess.
so now it's essentially it's like late 2013, early 2014. You're in Japan, and Mt. Gox announces that for those who don't know, Mt. Gox probably had 70 to 80% market share of all Bitcoin trading globally. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think at one time they were even higher than that. That sounds kind of ridiculous to think about now, right? Like one company that centralized. Yeah, it really was that bad.
Mt. Gox was the pivotal, or not the pivotal, the largest and most central company to the Bitcoin ecosystem. At this point,
Trade with confidence on the world's largest Bitcoin exchange. Remember
yes.
that?
At this point, it's the beating heart, the brain, the liver, and the kidneys. It's all of it of the body of Bitcoin.
Well,
And
you
one
had
day,
Bitstamp had just started, right? And I
sure,
think you had,
Bitstamp was, yeah, but it's small
and I think
peanuts
Coinbase
compared
too,
to
right? In
Mt.
the
Gox.
USA, you had Coinbase. No.
Again, small peanuts compared to Mt. Gox at this
Sure, sure.
point. At
Yes,
this point,
yes.
um, so Mt. Gox announces that I think something like 850,000 Bitcoin. So somewhere between 5 and 10% of all the Bitcoin in circulation at that time were missing or likely stolen.
Yeah, but
At the
even
time,
way before,
$500 million.
I mean, even way, way before they shut down
They
or
had a lot of
announced it.
problems.
Yeah, I mean that was the really painful part, right? Is that you didn't know what would happen if you deposited money on Gox. So I was doing that arbitrage trading,
And a
and
lot of people were. There was that Bitcoin builder guy who was buying. So what actually happened was you had Bitcoin on Mt. Gox and you had Mt. Gox Bitcoin, which were essentially like these fake Bitcoin that you could only trade within Mt. Gox system.
right, there was Gox BTC and there was
Gox BTC
real
and regular
BTC.
BTC,
Yeah.
but there were people buying. There was a whole secondary market. There were people buying Gox BTC, which were essentially Bitcoin that you couldn't remove from Mt. Gox before Mt. Gox imploded. There were people buying Gox BTC at a discount from, and there was one guy, I think his name was like Bitcoin Builder or something was his website, and he had so much faith in Bitcoin in Mt. Gox, and he bought a ton of it, and I don't know what ended up happening to him.
Well, he's one of the largest creditors of Mt. Gox now. But yeah,
Oh,
Josh
really?
Jones has had the Bitcoin builder I guess,
That was him.
exchange.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
A lot of my friends were able to actually get out of Mt. Gox because of him.
Yeah, but it was only like 15 cents on the dollar, 20 cents on the dollar. It
He could have
wasn't.
charged a lot more.
Yeah.
So he basically bought everyone's debt at barely a discount. When now you have hedge funds, if you have any debt on Mt. Gox, you have hedge funds that will buy your debt for what, 40 cents on the dollar?
No, I think it's more like 15 cents on the dollar. But he wasn't actually buying it himself. He actually created an exchange where people could place bid or ask orders for their Mt. Gox Bitcoins, right? And
So Bitfinex actually claims that they were the first ones to issue their own token as debt. But here you have Mt. Gox didn't do it themselves. The market created its own second. It's crazy to think about that for a second. Here you have a company where you have $500 million of debt that's in that people are saying, where is my money? $500 million worth. And it didn't implode yet, but you had this secondary market that was created by the market itself. Mt. Gox didn't do it. No, a few different companies did it to trade the debt before the company had even imploded.
Right. Mt. Gox had this feature where you could internally transfer Bitcoins between Mt. Gox accounts. And Josh Jones had created this system on top of that so that you could send your balance to his account, and then that would be your Bitcoin Builder exchange balance. You would have Gox BTC at that point, and then you could trade that for real BTC and then withdraw the real BTC.
Why were people willing to buy Mt. Gox debt even before Mt. Gox had imploded?
Well, it was a huge discount. I mean, if you genuinely believe that Mt. Gox was solvent, would you buy one Bitcoin for 0.15, for 15%? Of course you would, right? So it was a good bet, and even at the lowest market, I think you could buy Gox BTC for 2 or 3%. Basically, when Mark finally came out and announced that all was lost and we lost all the Bitcoins, because remember, there was a point where he came out and announced we only have 2,000 Bitcoins left.
I remember, like 2 or some crazy small number compared to the...
Basically almost zero. So at that point, the price on Bitcoin Builder crashed down to almost zero. And so you could buy Gox BTC extremely cheap. And then a few weeks later, he, quote unquote, found the 200,000 Bitcoin. And then that's what the Mt. Gox estate is primarily made up of now, is that asset, right?
So what happened? I mean, you're at ground zero of Mt. Gox, and in fact, you worked on. Did you work in an official capacity with what's his name, the creditor? Not the creditor. The word, I'm losing the word right now. Trustee Kobayashi.
No, so me and a bunch of other creditors made this company called Wiz Security Consulting, or WizSec, which I left actually pretty early on. I was kind of like the intro guy, or more accurately, the person who brought everyone into the room. So my colleague at Opera, his name is Kim Nilsson, an attorney from New York, Daniel Kelman, and Mark Karpeles. I mean,
Mark was involved?
Well, we weren't friends with Mark before we got Goxed, but once we started investigating the failure of Mt. Gox, we started talking to him and building a relationship with him, and I was baking apple pies in his kitchen.
No, you weren't.
Yes, I think there's a photo of me and Kim in Mark's kitchen published in like the Wall Street Journal where we're baking apple pies.
Oh, we lost. That's the best part. I want to hear that story.
Oh yeah, so at one point I would literally go to Mark's house with all this like whipped cream and other ingredients to bake apple pies. And Mark would teach me his secret family recipe for apple quiche. And we would bake apple pies. And I would essentially ask Mark, hey, can we have the Mt. Gox database? And he would say no. Or he would say something like, I don't have it, or something like that.
So give me this picture. You're in Mark's kitchen baking apple pie, and there's $500 million at stake, and you're just nonchalantly asking, hey, can I can we have the database? And Mark saying, can you go slice some more apples?
Pretty much. And slowly, maybe we'd get bits of it here and there as we kind of built a relationship with Mark over time. We would ask a whole bunch of questions, and maybe he would give us a little bit of data, and then we would kind of analyze that data and then go back to Mark and say, okay, this is what we found out from that data. And after you go back and forth enough times, he kind of sees that we're legit and trusts us more. And that's how we slowly got the whole thing. That was around the time I actually left the company, though, to go back as a freelancer. And so after I left, Kim essentially reconstructed the whole Mt. Gox database from various bits and pieces and crowdsourced some of it and this and here. And after he reconstructed the entire database, he analyzed it for a period of probably 2 or 3 years and cracked Mt. Gox. He did this amazing talk at a Bitcoin conference in Europe where he explained how Mt. Gox was hacked several times over several years. And he has this counter in the corner of his presentation where every time Mt. Gox gets hacked, another incident, the counter goes up on how many Bitcoins and how much cash was stolen this time. And turns out the majority of the Bitcoins were stole actually very early on in 2013 or before then, 2011 actually. And Mark was basically running a fractional reserve, maybe fractional reserve is not the correct term, an insolvent exchange for pretty much the entire time. I mean, if you look at the history, Mt. Gox was never really solvent, right? It was always...
Did Mark know?
Of course Mark knew. That's like, Charlie, if your BitInstant was short some Bitcoins, wouldn't you know immediately? Like, that's your job to know, right?
Sure, 100%.
Yeah, so
then
how hard is it to do a database query? Okay, what are the total number of customer liabilities? Oh, it's this amount. Okay, how many Bitcoins do we have in the account?
He was willfully ignorant. Do you think on purpose he would never do an audit?
Of course.
Maybe he said to himself, I know these coins are in cold storage. If I ever need them, I can access them.
Yeah, I don't know about the whole cold storage story that he was telling us. I remember being in Mark's kitchen after we had just baked an apple pie together, and I asked him straight to his face. I said, Mark, did you run the Willybot? And then he looked away and said, no, I didn't run the Willybot. Sure enough, a couple of years later in court, he acknowledged running the Willybot, and it was something that the original founder, Jed McCaleb, and him had been using for many, many years to move balances back and forth. Because
how was Jed involved in the Willybot in 2013?
I don't think Jed was involved in 2013, but when Mt. Gox kind of started, or during the transitionary period, Mt. Gox was hacked. And when it was short Bitcoins, I think it was short like 80,000 Bitcoins when Jed handed it over to Mark. He recommended to Mark to trade.
He was short how much Bitcoin?
80,000 Bitcoins, which wasn't a lot of money at the time, because I think
it wasn't a lot of money back then. No.
Right. I think Bitcoin was like 50 cents. So, you're short 40 grand. You could easily get an investor to put that in and cover the balance. Of course, Mark just kept the insolvency going, and he got worse and worse over time. But the purpose of the Willybot, from my understanding, was to basically move the money, or move the absence of money around, so that you could keep liquidity going on. And eventually Mark modified the bot to trade, to basically gamble with the customer's holdings, right, on the open market. So he would try and buy Bitcoin and sell Bitcoin, and he ended up just losing more and more money.
At this point, at the end of the day, down the road, when Mt. Gox is going through its civil rehabilitation or bankruptcy or whatever you want to call it, because there's, it goes back and forth. If I had $100 in Bitcoin in Mt. Gox at the time, how much will I get back?
Well, the cool thing about Mt. Gox being in bankruptcy is that the very slow and inefficient Japanese legal system essentially forces all the creditors to hold, right? You're holding your Bitcoin.
Same thing when I went to prison.
Exactly,
right?
Holding
through the bear market.
When you came out of prison, you must have done amazingly well on whatever Bitcoin you had stashed away. I remember when we were talking over email while you were in prison, You know,
Yeah, when I had the Bitcoin before I went into prison was $180, and when I got out it was maybe over 500. But I would have had to live on my Bitcoin over the next year and a half, which was still around 180, $200 during that year and a half. I would have to sell a lot of them.
right? Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, if maybe this could be a convenient service, is to craft a special Bitcoin transaction where you send Bitcoin to yourself in the future, where there's some kind of CSV time lock, a certain number
You
of.
could time lock Bitcoin, but you can also unlock that with a private key, right?
Yeah, I think there's a number of security concerns by doing it. Like, say there's some epic vulnerability discovered in Bitcoin. Well, you don't want your Bitcoin to be locked up in a unspendable address.
Yeah, that's the biggest issue with that.
But
So now all these people are forced holding, and so if you had $100 in Bitcoin back then, you may have 2 or 3 Bitcoin, and now when that comes out, you'll have right at these prices $15,000. However, so no matter what the haircut they have to take, they're going to make out all the creditors are going to make out, but then you'll have this huge influx of Bitcoin on the market. Do you think it'll cause like a price decline?
yeah, so there's this website called goxstocks.com where we did a post, or where someone did a post of the effects that Kobayashi dumping the Bitcoins had on the market. And if you look at the bubble, or whatever you want to call it, the bull run from late 2017, when Bitcoin starts to decline from its $20,000 peak, you can see all the times that the trustee sold Bitcoin. If you line up those dates on the price chart, those were exactly when all the big red candles were. So obviously dumping.
Why was he dumping? He's returning people's dollars.
Well, for whatever reason, he decided to sell a whole bunch of the Mt. Gox Bitcoins on the open market, even though Jesse at Kraken advised against it, and pretty much all the creditors want to be paid back Bitcoin as Bitcoin. But for some specific reasons under Japanese bankruptcy law, he has to pay out the claims, or at least some of the bankruptcy claims, as Japanese yen. So he did what he felt he had to do. Of course, he sold way more Bitcoins than he had to. I think he sold like twice as much Bitcoin as he had to. But for whatever reason, he dumped all this Bitcoins on the market, and that was probably why the crash was so severe in early 2018, was because of it was certainly helped a lot by that dumping pressure, right?
Now, Mark spends a year in prison and ends up being not guilty of a bunch of crimes, but becomes guilty of some low-level embezzlement charge, and essentially has to serve no more prison time except for what he already served. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think I actually tried to attend his sentencing hearing, but I couldn't get a seat in the courtroom. I think the crime he was actually convicted of was falsifying electronic records or something like this. And that was the Willy bot, and what he essentially admitted to doing during his criminal trial. But
Why would he admit that? Do you have the right in Japan to not incriminate yourself?
well, his whole argument was that he was doing it in defense, or I'm saying his whole argument was he was trying to get Mt. Gox out of the hole that it was in. He was trying to help the exchange. Basically, he didn't have any evil intentions. He didn't steal any Bitcoins, right? All the Bitcoins were stolen back in 2011 when the hot wallet was compromised, and he didn't either he didn't realize it, or for whatever reason the theft continued for many years until there was essentially nothing left. And the only real cold storage he had was those 200,000 Bitcoins that were stashed away and that he quote unquote forgot about. So
What's the involvement of BTCE in this?
that's actually a really good question that I don't think has fully been answered yet. So there's this Russian guy named Vinik who's arrested now, And I've heard a lot of things about this guy, but basically, from what I understand, he was single-handedly running BTCE, and for whatever reason, the stolen Mt. Gox bitcoins were essentially laundered through BTCE, and I don't know if he was involved in the thefts or if he was even aware of the thefts. I mean, it's probably likely that he was, at least to some degree, or maybe he didn't know at all, but it doesn't really matter at this point. I mean, several countries are trying to extradite him, and I think his life is pretty much over. For the real thing about BTCE getting shut down is I think the US government needed a good excuse to shut down an anonymous Russian Bitcoin exchange. And the fact that the stolen Mt. Gox Bitcoins were laundered through BTCE and this one guy was running it, and he just happened to be on vacation with his family in Greece where they could grab him. That's one conspiracy theory why they're kind of pinning it on this guy. Who knows? Maybe he was involved with theft. Maybe he was involved with laundering. I honestly don't know the full story. Maybe Kim does. You should invite him on your show.
I would love to. So do you foresee Mt. Gox level scams or exit scams happening in the crypto space in the future?
I don't know. I mean, it's much more
Have
regulated
we
these
grown up?
days. For example, in Japan, you have to do an insane amount of. I mean, it's almost like running a bank. The amount of paperwork you have to do for the compliance to get a license from the government to operate a crypto exchange. And I think in other countries like USA or even China, it's super super strict. So I mean, if you send your money off to some country like Malta, where there's no regulations and it's basically the Wild West, you can do anything there, then yeah, don't be
That's where
surprised.
Binance is based.
Well, I mean, CZ is probably doing a good job running it. I don't trade altcoins, so I don't really know, but yeah, I think whenever you have a single exchange that's run by a single person, it tends to not that story ends in a bad way usually, right?
Sure,
But when you
sure.
have a big company with lots of directors and auditors, then there's a much smaller chance of anything going wrong. Or if something does go wrong, like in the case of Bitstamp where they got hacked for $5 million worth of Bitcoin, you can just raise $5 million of new investment and become solvent again. So I think it's all about just not placing too much trust in a single person.
In hindsight, do you think that Mt. Gox was something that was necessary? Mt. Gox was coming from the market itself in order to self-regulate itself?
I don't know. I mean, there were still a lot of scams after Mt. Gox. I mean, even recently, the whole Quadriga scam. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if any of this is true, but I heard that before the guy died, he was essentially gambling with the customer funds on BitMEX or something like that.
We're going to have an episode where we dive into that, but and I'll get some people who are very close to him. I only spoke to him I think once, and I spoke to his partners a few times, but it was very odd that his partners all left right before he passed away. He was based in Canada, and he worked very closely with um, the other Canadian. Like, it's not like where Mt. Gox or BTCE, they're kind of like reclusive. Um, the Quadriga guys worked very closely with a lot of the prominent Canadian crypto companies.
Well, you could say that about
We'll
a lot
find
of
out.
exchanges that failed, right? I think,
Tune in next time. But
yeah, but I mean, how many large scale scams were,
what
doing?
about in the other industries? What about like in the regular banking? How many scams
Sure,
are there? How many banks go down? You hear this all the time.
sure. I think,
But then you could just print more money.
yeah, I think that's the thing with any big scam. A lot of them, once they have that certain critical mass of famous people who are affiliated with it, they can say, "Oh yeah, my investor is Charlie Shrem, so you should invest too." And this guy and this guy and this guy, and then before you know it, you've got all the money, and the Ponzi scam is completed, right?
Yeah, 100%. Do you think you'll live in Japan forever?
Yeah, I think it's the best country in the world, honestly.
I have to come visit soon. I think I'm next year. My plan is to take the train from Paris to China and then hop on a ferry.
Before airplanes were invented, there was this route called the Asian Highway, where you could actually go all the way from like Tokyo to Paris by land and sea. And
I'm doing it. I'm doing it on a train. It's the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
right, exactly. So
I'm doing it next year.
obviously, you can't go through North Korea anymore unless your country has a relationship with North Korea. But
Yeah,
you
I'm
can
gonna
certainly
pass.
go from Tokyo to Seoul without using airplane. And that's a really fun trip if you spend a few nights in each city. You should check that out.
I did. I will. I will. So tell me when you started mining Bitcoin.
So actually, I started mining Bitcoin in my house as a hobby. And the first serious mining operation I did was when Ethereum started. So this is when I played around with Ethereum a little bit. Of course, now I'm Bitcoin only, but back in those days, I think Ethereum started trading at like $4, something like that. And I had a bunch of GPUs. What I essentially did was I rented this huge warehouse in Los Angeles that had a bunch of electrical capacity, and we built over 100 mining rigs, in a few weeks, and we were killing it, man. I mean, we were mining so much Ethereum, just not even using mining pools, just solo mining Ethereum like crazy. And then the big fork happened. So I don't know if you know about the DAO because it kind of happened when you were in prison, I
No,
think.
I remember. I
Okay.
remember. I was actually living in a halfway house when I found out about the DAO.
Okay, so that was right after you got out, right? So it was one of the first ICOs on Ethereum for sure, called the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And these guys, they market it as, if you clicked on terms of service, they would say stuff like code is law, like we don't have any terms because the code is the terms, man. They were trying to be so cool. And sure enough, there were all these security vulnerabilities in their smart contract, and he got totally hacked. So right, so Vitalik came out in his infinite wisdom and said we're going to do a hard fork to bail out the DAO. And when I heard that, I thought he was crazy because that goes against everything that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies stand for. You can't do a rollback. You can't do a chargeback. I mean, if you're going to do a chargeback because your thing got hacked, you might as well just run a bank, right? It might just well be a centralized database. Why do you even have a blockchain? So as soon as I
A lot of
started,
people
as soon as
said
I,
that Ethereum lost its immutability at that point and it ceased being a decentralized cryptocurrency at that point.
oh, for sure. It was very short term oriented. He was not thinking long term at all. So, as soon as I heard that he was going to do the hard fork bailout, I immediately told my investors, all right, we're going to keep mining the old consensus rules no matter what happens. And we ended up mining something like 26,000 Ethereum Classic over the course of like 2 or 3 days, which at the time it wasn't even traded. It was essentially worthless. It was so funny how confident these guys that the old chain would just be totally abandoned. They didn't have any replay protection. I mean, this is the first real fork. You got to remember too. There wasn't a really big blockchain fork before this that was so controversial. And
There was a Bitcoin fork. Well, a lot of people say that it wasn't a real fork, but and when we upgraded to version, I think it was version 8, and it was incompatible with a lower version, and it actually forked Bitcoin for a little bit. But
right,
that was different.
right, that was not a contentious fork, right? That was more of a technical bug or something, right? It wasn't like a philosophical reason for
Yes.
the so Um, yeah, so this is crazy. I think at the time I was like 0.2% of the entire Ethereum hash rate, and essentially 99.5% of the Ethereum hash rate went along with the hard fork, and they started mining on the new consensus rules. So here I am with my 0.2%. Now
And you're
about
like, no.
Yeah, and I basically said, no, reject the fork. So now I'm mining on this old consensus rules, but suddenly I'm 50% of the hash power. So this was pretty crazy. I actually unintentionally did a 51% attack. So if you look on the Ethereum Classic blockchain, you'll see where there's this huge string of blocks that were just all mined by me. I think it was like 30 or 40 blocks in a row where other people were mining blocks, but because I was solo mining all the blocks on like my local network, I was just orphaning other people's blocks, and like not
But why were
intention.
your blocks different than other people's blocks?
They weren't. Well, you got to remember, Ethereum has an extremely short block time. It's something like 12 seconds. So if you're in China and I'm in USA somewhere mining with my GPUs, and the latency from USA to China is like 200 or 300 milliseconds, and maybe the verification time of the block, say, rounds up to 1 second. If one of the miners on my local network solves a block and someone in China solves a block at the same time, of course, it's going to be propagated on my LAN way faster than it's going to be propagated across the ocean. So I would always just orphan other people's blocks. And even though it was only a short time, like a few hours that I was doing this, it was really interesting to see that my unintentional 51% attack became 100% of the Ethereum hash power because I was orphaning other people's blocks. It really shows you like how powerful having 51% of the hash power is. But
So how come your blocks weren't part of the new Ethereum Classic, and why didn't you end up mining for Ethereum Classic after that?
no, I was mining Ethereum Classic. That would the old consensus rules are now known as Ethereum Classic. At the time, it was like there was this weird ticker. There was like ETHC and ETHH or something like that. And now it's standardized and traded. But yeah, I mined something like 26,000 Ethereum Classic in 2 days. So it was totally worthless. And I think on the third day, Poloniex started trading it.
Poloniex.
Poloniex, yes, thank you. And they started trading at like $2. And I was like, oh my God, this is great. I just made like 50 grand in like 2 days, right? And then it kept going up, and I think the peak of the market was like $40 or $42 for like one Ethereum Classic. So if you think about it, in those 2 days, at the peak market value, that was like $1 million worth of ETC I had mined, which is a pretty good call in retrospect. And I think Kyle Torpey even wrote an article about this mining thing. So of course now when Bitcoin forks, everyone's trying to mine on the minority chain and do all these kind of
It's a free hedge. It's a free option.
right. It's a free option, but back in the day when the first real contentious fork happened on Ethereum, I would argue that I was the only serious miner that realized like, hey, there's a huge opportunity for profit here if I'm right. I basically told my investors like, look, if I'm wrong, yeah, we lose like 2 or 3 days of hash power. Who cares? But if I'm right, this could be extremely profitable, and it was a very good call in retrospect. It was probably the best call of my entire mining career. But that was, I think that was
That was a
back in like,
pivotal moment for you.
well, that was back in like 2015, 2016, whenever Ethereum was doing its thing. And that was after that, I took my profits from that and I went back to Bitcoin. Um, I basically walked away from that mining operation. I mean, had investors and guys who are still doing it now, but the Bitcoin, yeah, just after that, I just really focused on Bitcoin. I just wanted to be 100% Bitcoin maximalist.
Why?
And well, I think it was that moment when Vitalik announced the hard fork when I realized that every other coin besides Bitcoin is not pure, right? Like Bitcoin is like this immaculate conception money, whereas everything else is launched by a person or launched by a company. Bitcoin is the only real organic grassroots run by the community in a true decentralized way. Like you said earlier, it's the only coin that has even the slightest chance of winning, right? Against traditional fiat currencies, anyway.
But you're a capitalist, right?
Well, sure. But what I mean to say is, I don't think Ethereum is going to put USD or JPY out of business. It's more of a competitor to banks than it is a competitor to the underlying fiat currencies themselves. Like you said earlier in the podcast, how is Bitcoin going to take on Venmo? And I think that's the mistake that a lot of these altcoins make, is that they think the competition is Venmo, but the competition is the Federal Reserve or the central banks, or anyone who's issuing Zimbabwe dollars. It's all just monopoly money, right?
Sure, 100%. And those Venmos are operating on top of a legacy financial system. So if we create a better financial system, then eventually people can create apps and programs like Venmos on top of the Bitcoin network, and the user experience of Bitcoin itself doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I mean, look at gold, for example. Gold has been the best store of value for thousands of years, and it has zero merchant adoption, right? I mean, there's almost zero apps to trade gold, right? But that just goes to show you that you don't really need to have a good UX to be a very hard money. And Bitcoin has already accomplished that, right? Like even like command line Bitcoin is way better UX than gold, where you have to like physically move in a vault with armed guards to protect it and all this crazy stuff. You can just push a button.
But you have these, I just don't understand why you kind of walked away from making money. And I understand you have a fundamental belief in Bitcoin as the ultimate end all be all, and as do I. But if you're mining another coin, or buying and trading it, why not do that if you're making money on the side?
Sure. And I think the real answer is, if you're a true Bitcoin maximalist, you see the scam of printing money as the real problem that Bitcoin was created to solve. And so that you don't want to engage in supporting altcoins or ICO tokens that print money.
But if they're going to die anyways, who cares?
Well, the reason I mine Bitcoin personally is because I want to support Bitcoin's decentralization nature, so that it's not all going to trend towards where people have cheap electricity or free or stolen electricity siphoned from the grid. I want to do it in a country, in Japan, where it's actually very expensive to mine, except I want to use out of the box ideas to kind of subsidize my electrical costs, either with
How do you do that?
So in Japan, we have this really cool feed-in tariff program that was started after the Fukushima nuclear plants melted down, where the government will guarantee and basically subsidize any electric company, actually force them to buy whatever power you feed into the grid at a huge premium over what it's going for on the.
What type of premium?
So for example, I can buy power from the grid at like 10 yen per kilowatt hour, but I can sell solar power to the grid at like 18 yen per kilowatt hour. So I only have to generate about half as much as what I consume to break even cash wise on the electric bill.
And how do you in a place like Japan that's not very big, and you have so much of a mountainous regions, and most people live in cities, how do you generate that much electricity?
So most of Japan is actually centralized in cities like Tokyo, right? If you go out into the countryside, there's actually a ton of just ghost towns and empty farmlands that's totally not being used. Like, you can actually find some houses where you could probably buy them for $1 or get land for free. Land is actually the cheapest and easiest thing to get.
Why?
Okay, I'll give you an example. The town where I'm building my solar farm, there's just no people there. There's no economy. There's no jobs. You might, on a very busy day, you might see one other person who would be a 90-year-old lady, gardening in her front yard, and her kids who are like in their 60s and 70s are probably taking care of her. but all the young people will go to a city like Tokyo where they can have an actual career. The only way you're able to make a successful business out in the deep countryside of Japan is to do a truly self-sovereign, decentralized business like solar farm or Bitcoin mining, where you don't need customers, right? You're just working for the Bitcoin network directly. And anybody else, all the normal non-techie people who have to go to the office every day, there's just no companies out here to work for, right? Except for like maybe the local utility companies or the train companies, something like that. There's just
Or the
no
government.
jobs. Right.
Very interesting. And so today you're building out this solar farm and you're creating your own electricity. Would you say that you're pretty much um, mining Bitcoin at almost at cost of the equipment? Your electricity doesn't cost you much?
That's the thing, right? So what I want to, my end goal is to have the option to, for example, if Bitcoin was 20 grand right now, I'd crank up all my miners to 115% of what they're supposed to do, right? I'd use as much electricity from the grid as I could. But in a bear market, I would have the exact opposite strategy. I'd want to only mine as little as I could using the most efficient miners. And I'd actually probably want to sell as much power to the grid as I could. So, you know what I mean? There's a very there's an actual strategy to my mining business, whereas everyone else who mines, they pretty much just go wherever in the world has the cheapest electricity, plug in the box, and they get money out of it. They don't even care about Bitcoin. They just care about making money. So I'm doing it in a way where I want to support Bitcoin from Japan, where it's actually very expensive to do so. So, but the good side is I actually get a strategy out of it, right? I can decide how I want to mine. I can decide when I want to mine, and it's a lot more flexible. There's a lot more strategy involved, right?
Do you mine Bitcoin to then sell and then to put that money to live off of and then to reinvest it in it? Or are you someone who has the means to essentially mine your Bitcoin and live off something else and you're holding Bitcoin just long term?
So I do my mining as a company, and I have investors in my company, and I have to, of course, look out for my shareholders' interest. So originally, when my one of my first mining business structures was very, very simple. In fact, you could explain it in like 4 sentences. It was number one, how much money do we raise from the investors? And then number two, how much how many Bitcoin miners or how many GPU mining rigs do we build with that money? And then number three, how many Bitcoins did we mine with those miners? And after paying the expenses, number four, what's the net profit return? And that just gets paid out to investors on like a pro rata percentage basis. That's a very simple, typical business model for a mining company.
That's kind of how most companies operate.
Right. But after that, there was a number of problems. And I think you actually asked me earlier on, like, well, why did I walk away from that mining business or something? Whenever you have that structure, and of course there are ways to avoid this with, shareholders agreements or whatnot, voting rights. But in that company, we had so many investors that I was diluted down to like 18% or something like this. And there was a lot of drama. There was investors like fighting with other investors, saying I invested first, so I should get a better share price and blah, blah, blah. And I realized that I needed to kind of isolate each investor into their own investment vehicle or their own farm, essentially, because every investor has their own risk profile, or like you said, some people just want to sell the Bitcoin right away and get some cash out. Some of them want to reinvest 100% of that back into buying more miners or expanding the farm. And that's what the investors would argue with that. So to just prevent all of that drama, now one of the business models I have now is the company actually doesn't do any mining for itself. The company doesn't have investors. The company has customers. So maybe it's a little bit more similar to mining contracts, but the mining contracts are for very, very big customers. So say, for example,
A lot of mining contracts are scams, though.
totally agree with you. And yeah, so this would be like a legit mining contract. So for example, it's actually more like a hosting company or more like a data center business. So, okay, Charlie, say you give me $250,000 and we use that money to buy X amount of Bitcoin miners. Those are your miners. You own them. Then you're going to host them in my facility. So my company owns and operates the facility and kind of manages your miners.
But they're my miners.
Yes. And we just charge like a management fee and we take a percentage of the Bitcoins. And of course, we have to pay the electric bill and things
Do
like
most companies operate that way?
that.
Mining server farms? Or are they owned by...
Like you said, most mining contract companies are scams. Some of them
Well, forget mining contract companies. The reason I'm asking is that a lot of people say that Bitcoin is actually not really decentralized. It's more centralized because there's only a few dozen mining farms that are mining. And then you have also mining pools. And there's only like 3 or 7 or even 10 pools. And at any given day, 3 pools can make up 51% of the Bitcoin network. And my response to that is always, well, at the end of the day, mining pools don't vote on behalf of their miners. Miners vote themselves.
Well, it's true in the sense that the mining pools certainly do control the hash power of their users, right? There's only a few pools that allow the users to directly control what transactions they mine into the blocks. Or I think in the case of Slush Pool, they actually allow the users to vote and take that vote into consideration. Most of the mining pools are just kind of like authoritarian, totalitarian, whoever runs the mining pool.
But if a mining pool was behaving badly and giving up the integrity of the Bitcoin network, those miners would leave, theoretically.
Yeah, in theory, that's how it would work. But yeah, I mean, in that sense, the hash power of Bitcoin is certainly it's not as distributed as you would like. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to do my project out in the countryside of Japan, is I'm trying to decentralize that Bitcoin hash power. Of course, my percentage would be 0.0001% or something tiny like that, but I'm just trying to do my part. If everyone in the world had some Bitcoin miners in their house, and maybe this is another business model for miners, which I think 21 was the name of the company that tried to do this a while back, where they would make some kind of chip that would go in.
Well, I had heard that this company was trying to launch Bitcoin miners in toasters, but then, and I was in prison when they did this. When I got out, I was excited to buy one, but then I heard that they didn't actually make toast.
Yeah,
so they're sitting in your kitchen mining Bitcoin, and they don't even make toast.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, right? But I think in practice, the way ASIC miners are kind of developed, first of all, like the hardware goes obsolete very, very quickly, simply because electricity is extremely expensive. It's a finite resource, energy and time, right? So you only want to mine if it's profitable, obviously. So if you have a chip in your TV that's using 10 cents of electricity but only mining 5 cents of Bitcoin, well, your company's not going to succeed, right? I mean, maybe if the consumer doesn't know that they're paying for that electricity, and it's kind of like it rapidly becomes like some kind of scam or stealing electricity from people. You know what I mean? There's
do you believe that?
Yeah, there's that's the thing, right? Mining is so complicated with the hardware and the electricity market.
Let's talk about electricity for a second. So, and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong and how I'm wrong. But my belief, and I will be the first one to admit that I'm wrong very often. But what I will say is, what I say to environmentalists who say that Bitcoin is bad for the environment, I say, but you have to understand, guys like Wizs and other big mining groups are not siphoning electricity from hospitals to mine for Bitcoin. Actually, what they're doing is they're building out more alternative and better, cleaner, and cheaper forms of energy. And then the excess of that energy is then being used for places like hospitals and things like that in China. And if it wasn't for Bitcoin mining, the environmental movement would actually be at a huge loss right now. No one will pay attention to them.
Yeah, actually, I've been studying electricity quite a bit and the electricity markets, I guess, for about a year now. And it's actually really interesting how the world gets its electricity and why the price is so radically different in so many markets and countries. So, of course, the best form of energy that you could possibly ever have so far is nuclear power, right? I mean, imagine this: it's essentially a magical box that just generates a ton of heat. And in fact, it gets so hot that you can run all these boilers and steam and run turbines from it for free 24 hours a day, and it's 365 days a year, 100% reliable. And if the city needs more electricity, you can just kind of put a fuel rod in there or some other control rods to like make it hotter. Or at nighttime, maybe the city doesn't use so much power, you can turn the nuclear reaction speeds down with some different control rods. Nuclear is actually the best form of electricity. Of course, however, if you screw up, you kind of fuck over the entire city, right? So that huge risk is the epic problem that why nuclear has such a bad rap. I think there's actually modern designs for nuclear reactors which are passively cooled and don't require active cooling, because I mean that's the reason why Fukushima and Chernobyl and all these plants had meltdowns, is because in Fukushima the tsunami and the earthquake kind of knocked out the cooling system. So the magical box with all the nuclear fuel in it that gets really, really hot wasn't getting cooled, and it melted down. And so now the modern design of nuclear reactors is passive cooling. So even if you have no cooling system at all, it will not melt down or blow up or anything like that. And it's totally safe in that sense. And it's very miniature sized. And after a number of years, you can just kind of, take that box somewhere else. So the design for nuclear reactors is getting much better. And if you compare that to something like solar or wind, solar power is actually very unreliable, right? Because if it's a cloudy day, or if it's winter and it snows, you might actually generate zero electricity the entire day if your solar panels are covered in snow. And wind is actually the most inconsistent electricity generation device, because if the wind blows or if the wind doesn't blow,
then you're screwed.
Yeah, you're screwed, right? But and you compare that to that nuclear reactor, which just generates as much electricity as you want 24/7, 365, right? So the end result,
Yeah, they have battleships that are powered by nuclear reactor that never need to refuel. Like the life expectancy of the reactor is like 80 something years, and they're small. They fit into like a box, like the size of your laptop.
exactly, it's like magic, right? It's the best form of energy. So the end result of solar
It's the best, but it's the most dangerous.
yes, the most dangerous. So I think eventually nuclear fusion, which is totally safe compared to nuclear fission, will be invented, and then we'll have free energy essentially.
I was listening to a talk by a scientist who claimed that in the future, one of the most technical innovations that we have, well, you'll be able to walk into a store and buy a small nuclear reactor, like you said, nuclear fusion, and be able to keep it in your house and generate as much electricity as you need for 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, that's the dream, huh? So yeah, if you compare solar and wind to that, I mean, solar and wind pretty much suck compared to that, right? Because the sun only shines 5 or 6 hours a day on average if you're lucky, right? So that's on a clear day. If it's on a cloudy day, or
Has the solar panel industry peaked?
no, I mean, solar panels are getting the technology is improving all the time, and I think what will eventually happen is that solar panels will become so efficient that it will be financially feasible, or it'll just be cheaper to use solar than like gas or whatever other traditional generation methods people are using. You're never going to get to the free energy factor of nuclear.
No, of course.
but you can
Not
do
for a
better
while, at
than
least.
gasoline, right? And that's where Tesla is really making a lot of progress in their solar panels and batteries and electric cars. I mean, they kind of leading the industry, but in terms of building
But
your,
you can't go fully off the grid with Tesla, and even with anything. So
why not?
um, I well, I love what you said about Japan about selling energy back to the government that they, at a premium. But I live here in Florida. I live on an island, and we get hurricanes a lot. At least one bad storm a year, and so we once a year we'll have to evacuate. So much so that people keep second houses on the mainland just as like hurricane houses. A lot of people do. So I live on this island, and it's great. Electricity is not expensive in Florida. Um, I heavily look into trying to go off the grid as it relates to my energy. I looked into two things. I looked into a generator, so I don't have natural gas pipes running under my house on the island. They don't have natural gas, and even if they did, natural gas is one of the first thing that gets shut off during a hurricane because they're afraid of leaking and fires and explosions. So they shut the gas off. Even before you lose electricity, you lose gas. So that was out. The second option is propane. I have a small propane tank under my house, 250 gallons, and that propane tank powers my stove, a washing machine dryer, the hot water heater for the shower, and a hot tub heater. So I don't need much. 250 gallons last half a year or whatever it is. So I looked into it, and they said, well, if you put a 1,000-gallon tank under your house and you put in a generator in, and it's full, theoretically, you could have power for almost a month. And that, I mean, without getting a delivery. And so I'm saying to myself, okay, a month is a pretty long time, but the cost for that would be $30,000 to $50,000. And then the third option is solar, but my roof is not big enough to hold enough panels to be able to give me my daily need and then have enough and backup in there for a few weeks. You need farms for that. You don't have, solar panels are not efficient enough. However, that's not the problem. The problem is in Florida is that when the Florida Power and Light, the main utility, because every state only has one utility, even though technically they're private companies, but they're really not because there's only one. You don't have a choice really. Kind of in New York, you do now. You have Con Edison, you have Ambit Energy. They've broken up the monopolies, but 99% of the population still only has one choice when it comes to their energy needs. However, if Florida Power and Light says energy is off and they shut off the power, you have to shut off your power as well. Right. So if I have my own generator or my own solar energy and I'm running and they shut off the power, my power has to shut off too. And the reason for this is they say, because it sounds crazy, it's my power, why do I have to shut it off? They say is that they don't want your power going into the grid when their grid is off. And I understand that. And then they offer people have built these hack kind of devices that enable like triggers that if the power is off, but you're still creating energy, it'll keep your house on. But you can get heavily fined for that. It's crazy.
Well, I've actually, as part of my research into the solar farms, I've actually built a few off-grid systems. And you can literally go on Amazon right now and for a few $100, get a couple solar panels and a battery pack and a charge controller and an inverter and have an off-grid system. You can assemble it in an afternoon, even if you have very little roof area or wherever you're going to put the panels. It's actually really simple to set that up. But like you said, if you want to power an entire house off of it, it's just very difficult to do unless you have a lot of real estate.
We got to create a token for that.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, if that's the thing, right? Token energy is a finite resource, but tokens are infinite, right? So
yeah. So how do you tokenize something like that? But listen, we're almost 2 hours into this. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Our guests can catch you on twitter.com/WIZ. Wiz, thank you so much. We're going to have you on again in the next few weeks because we have so much more to talk about. Really, thank you so much for coming on the show, and have a great night.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. New episodes of Untold Stories go live every Tuesday at 7 a.m. EST. Links to our Apple and Spotify channels are in the show notes. You can also follow me on Twitter, Charlie Shrem, to continue the conversation. See you next week.